Good day to each and everyone. My name is Maria. Good day to each and everyone. My name is Maria Ellen P. Onyot from Business M3A, and today we will discuss the law on obligations and contracts. But before we go into the details, here are our learning objectives. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify different types of obligations and contracts. Second is explain how obligations can be fulfilled or terminated. And lastly, understand how contracts work in the tourism, travel, and hospitality industry. Okay, so before I forgot, here's the topic outline for this chapter. So the laws on obligations and contracts. Second is the classification of obligations. Third is modes of extinguishing obligations. Fourth is characteristics of a contract. And lastly is the classification of contracts. So now let's get started. So what are obligations and contracts? So obligation said that it is a legal duty to give, do, or not to do something, while contracts are agreements that create obligations between two or more parties. So assume that a person desiring to engage in a business in the tourism, travel, and hospitality industry will surely meet certain obligations. Agreements arising from contracts will have to be made, and potential breach from these agreements will be encountered. Therefore, there is a need to study the fundamental principles involving law on obligations and contracts. So again, obligations are legal responsibilities that require someone to give, do, or refrain from doing something. Meanwhile, contracts are agreements that create obligations between two or more parties. For instance, when a customer books a tour package, the travel agency is obligated to provide the agreed-upon services. If they fail to do so, they may be held legally accountable. Understanding these concepts helps ensure fairness in business transactions. Elements of an obligation. Every obligation has four key elements. The active subject is the one who has the right to demand something, like a hotel guest expecting a reserved room, while the passive subject is the one responsible for the fulfilling the obligation, like the hotel providing you a room. The third one is the object, or the prestation is what needs to be delivered, such as the room itself. And lastly, the juridical tie, that is the legal bond that connects the parties, such as the booking confirmation. Without these four elements, an obligation does not exist. Also, it is important to identify the prestation in a certain obligation. Once the prestation is identified, you can determine who the passive subject is and whom the active subject can demand fulfillment of the obligation. And now, let's talk about the types of obligations. So obligations can be classified into three main types. First is the obligation to give a determinate thing, in which it requires delivering a specific thing or service, such as to deliver the thing which he has obligated himself to give, or to take care of the thing with the proper diligence of a good father of a family. Or lastly, to deliver all its accessories and accessions, or to pay damages in case of breach of obligation. For example, a hotel must provide a book suite to a guest. Second is the obligation to do. This requires performing an act or service. For example, if the debtor fails to do what he is obliged to do, it will be done at his expenses. Second, if the work is done in contravention of the tenor of the obligation, it will be redone at debtor's expenses. Third is that if the work is poorly done, it will be redone at debtor's expense. Example, a tour guide must conduct a sightseeing tour as promised. Third, obligation not to do. So this requires refraining from a specific action. So for example, a hotel agrees not to disclose guest information to third parties. So the obligation is not to do means refraining from an action, like a hotel keeping guest information confidential. Understanding these distinctions helps clarify legal duties in business transactions. So after that, we will now talk about the sources of liability of an obligation. So for instance, in a party, there may be a liable for damages if they commit fraud or negligence. So fraud occurs when someone intentionally deceives another to avoid fulfilling an obligation. So this is called dolo incidente, which is a fraud incident to the performance of an obligation. In fraud, there is an intent to evade the normal fulfillment of the obligation and to cause damage. For example, like a travel agency selling a fake package. This is deceiving and a fraud. While negligence referred here in the case of contracts is culpa contractual. This is the lack of diligence or carelessness. Negligence consists in the omission of the diligence which is required by the nature of the obligation and corresponds with the circumstances of the persons or the time and of the place. This usually happens when there is lack of care, like a hotel failing to maintain fire safety measures. Recognizing these liabilities helps businesses operate responsibly and protect customer interests, such as a tour bus company failing to maintain vehicle safety leading to an accident. Case application of the law. This case is about Dr. Filipa Pablo versus Alitalia Airlines. So the case is Dr. Filipa Pablo, an associate professor and research grantee, booked a flight with Alitalia Airlines to attend a United Nations meeting in Italy. Upon arrival in Milan, she was informed that her luggage, which contained crucial research materials, was delayed. Despite her efforts to locate it, she failed to retrieve her belongings in time, preventing her from attending the conference. The luggage was only delivered to her 11 months later, long after it was needed. So the legal opinion is, Alitalia Airlines negligence caused Dr. Pablo significant distress and professional damage. She is entitled to nominal damages for the inconvenience and the emotional suffering she endured. The Warsaw Convention's prescribed compensation for baggage delays does not adequately cover the losses suffered by Dr. Pablo. Delay, mora, in obligation. So a debtor is considered in delay when they fail to fulfill their obligation after a demand has been made by the creditor. However, demand is not necessary in the following cases. First is when the law explicitly states that demand is unnecessary. Second, when the contract specifies that demand is not required. Third is that when time is of the essence. And fourth is when demand would be useless. So in contracts, deadlines matter. If an obligation is not fulfilled on time, that debtor may be held liable. However, there are instances where a demand is unnecessary, such as when a contract explicitly states a deadline or when waiting for a demand would be impractical. For example, if a wedding caterer fails to deliver food on the wedding day, demanding later would be useless. Understanding these rules helps us protect our rights in contractual agreements. The basis of legal obligations. So obligations arise from various sources under Article 1157 of the Civil Code. Law. Some obligations are imposed by law, such as paying taxes, while contracts, under this, is agreements that create enforceable duties between parties. So quasi-contracts, it is a legal obligations that arise even without a formal contract, such as when person benefits from another service without prior agreements but is still expected to compensate for it. Another one is the acts or omissions punishable by law. So these criminal actions create liabilities such as paying restitution for theft. Lastly is the quasi-delex. A person is responsible for damages caused by negligence, even if there is no contractual relationship, like a hotel being liable for a guest injury due to unsafe premises. So obligations are not just created by contracts. Some arise by law, like our duty to pay taxes. Others are formed through quasi-contracts, such as when a person benefits from another's act and must compensate them fairly. Additionally, crimes and negligence can create legal liabilities. And understanding the sources of the obligations helps businesses and individuals comply with the law. So now, let's discuss the law, and which is obligations arise primarily from two sources, the law and the contracts. While quasi-contracts, crimes, and quasi-delex may seem like separate sources, they are actually obligations imposed by law as established in Longbin versus O'Brien. A contract is defined as a meeting of the minds, where one party binds themselves to give something or render a service to another. Quasi-contracts, on the other hand, arise from lawful, voluntary, and unilateral acts that prevent unjust enrichment at another's expense. So the two common forms are solutio indebiti, a payment by mistake, and a negotiorum gestio, or a management of an abandoned business without consent. So civil obligations arising from criminal offenses are governed by the revised penal code and the civil code on damages, including moral, exemplary, and nominal damages. Quasi-delicts, also known as culpa aliena, refer to negligent acts causing damage without pre-existing contractual relationship. So, classification of obligations. So, the Civil Code classifies obligations into primary classifications, such as pure and conditional obligations, in which obligations with a period, alternative, and facultative obligations, joint and solidary obligations, divisible and indivisible obligations, and obligations with a penal clause. Secondary classification is unilateral and bilateral obligations, real and personal obligations, civil and natural obligations, and legal, conventional, and penal obligations. So obligations can be categorized based on their conditions, structure, and enforceability. Understanding these classifications help in analyzing contractual agreements and determining the rights and duties of parties involved. There is a modes of extinguishing obligations. So obligations are extinguished through various means, including payment or performance, loss of the objective due, condonation or remission, confusion or merger, compensation and novation. Additional causes include annulment, recession, fulfillment of a resolutory condition, and prescription. So we also have here fortuitous events. So a fortuitous events, also known as force majeure, exempts an obligor from liability if the event is enforceable and unavoidable. Example includes natural disasters, war, and robbery with violence. However, negligence can still be imputed if proper precautions were not taken. Due to condonation or remission, obligations do not last indefinitely. The most common way to extinguish an obligation is through performance or payment. However, other means such as condonation or forgiveness of debt, or confusion when the creditor and debtor merge into one, or novation, replacing an obligation with a new one, can also apply. So force majeure is an important legal concept that prevents liability in cases beyond human control. However, if negligence is involved, such as failing to store goods securely, liability may still arise. And now let's define the term contract. So a contract is an agreement between two or more persons where one binds themselves to give something or provide a service. This agreement is based on the mutual consent of the parties involved and is legally enforceable. So in simple terms, a contract is an agreement between two parties that creates an obligation to do or not to do something. It is legally binding, meaning that if one party fails to comply, the other party can seek legal remedies. So there's an essential elements of a contract, and a valid contract must include three essential elements. These are the consent, in which the agreement must be clear and both parties must fully understand and accept the terms. Second is the object, so the subject of the contract must be specific and lawful. And lastly is the cause, and there must be a valid reason or purpose for the agreement. So these elements ensure that a contract is legally valid. Without consent, the contract may be void, and the object must be something legal, and the cause must be justifiable for the contract to hold. So there's also a contract of adhesion. So a contract of adhesion is one where almost all terms are set by one party, and the other party has little choice but to accept. These are common in standard agreements such as insurance policies. While some argue that contracts of adhesion limit fairness, they are generally legal as long as the other party voluntarily agrees to the terms, and if it is unfair, provision exists and courts can intervene. So now, we will talk the characteristics of contracts. So contracts possess the following characteristics: the mutuality, in which both parties must agree to the terms; the autonomy, when parties can freely define their terms as long as they follow the law. Third is relativity. Contracts only bind those who agree to them; and consensuality. Most contracts are valid through agreement alone. And lastly is the obligatory force. Once agreed, a contract must be followed. So these principles ensure fairness and enforceability. Contracts must be mutual, freely made, and respected by all parties. For our last topic, which is the classification of contracts. So contracts can be classified based on their nature, such as preparatory contracts, principal contracts, accessory contracts. And another classification on contracts based on the requirements is, for example, is the consensual contracts, real contracts, common contracts, formal contracts. And there's also a classification of contracts based on the purpose and subject. These are the transfer of ownership, conveyance of use, service contracts, and things or services. There's a lot of classification of contracts, and it depends on their requirements or based on their classification. And that's all for my report, and I hope you learned something. Again, my name is Maria Ellen P. Onyot of BSHM 3A, and thank you.